Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Racklin. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can get more information about the show, listen to past episodes, connect with us on social media. If you want to call or text us at any time, you can do so at 202-656-6271. Wow, what a day. We've been waiting for it for a long time, and it has finally come to pass. George Santos has been expelled from the House of Representatives. They tried it twice, and third time was the charm. They finally got him out. It took a vote of 2/3, and they did it. And this is something we've been following for a long time. Earlier this year, we had a list of the greatest lies of George Santos, but I don't think anybody has been following it as long as Mark Chiusano. He is the author of The Fabulous, The Lying, Hustling, Grifting, Stealing, and Very American Legend of George Santos. Mark Chiusano, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Very excited.
So how long have you been following him? When did you first become aware of and start reporting on George Santos?
So the first time I called him was in 2019. I had been assigned a little piece about him by my editor. Basically, he was this new candidate who was coming out of nowhere to run against a sort of strong incumbent on Long Island. And so my editor said, give him a call. I did. He picked up and he said, today is actually, I'm launching my campaign today. And I write about this in the book. He tells me I'm launching my campaign today, very excited, but he says he's in Florida at the time on business. And so that was like this first weird thing with him. Like, why are you launching your campaign from Florida for this New York district? And he had excuses like he always does. That's a pattern with him too, is his like many excuses. But it was the first strangeness with him for me.
So right from the beginning, there was this thing that indicated to you that there was something a little bit off. Like, why is he doing things in this strange way? Why is he providing so many excuses? So it basically just continued from there. Like, I'm fascinated by his character. How did that build over the course of time, and how did you see that continue over the course of his campaigns?
Yeah, there were so much of it was there from the beginning. I actually just went back to that very first conversation I had with him and remembered that he told me, oh, my campaign finance filings aren't up yet, but I don't know why. Like, I did a file, like, I don't know what's going on. It was always excuses and sort of these like low level schemes and sketchiness from the beginning. And, things kept popping up. So I was writing for this newsletter at the time, and at one point, this was at the height of COVID, and he had a kind of maskless fundraiser indoors when I think New York, you weren't even allowed to be gathering at such levels at that time. And then he had excuses about that. He said, oh, actually, I did have a mask on when I wasn't at the table. And, there were pictures of him without a mask on. So it was always excuses. At one point, he retweeted some QAnon slogans, and I wrote about that, and he claimed he didn't know what they were. Always something with him.
What do you think is wrong with George Santos? Like, I know that you're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but what is going on? It almost seems like he has some sort of like he's literally a compulsive liar. Like there's something going on with his mentality that compels him to tell lies. It seems like a psychological condition to me almost.
Yeah. What I tried to do in the book was compile all these stories about him to get sort of firsthand experience from people who'd run into him over the years about what he was doing and why. And so I think that there's a few reasons. I think that he himself has said this, that he at times has been a really insecure individual, right? And so the lies on some level are a way to kind of boost him and make him look better, right? He did a lot of work to shape his body. He did used Ozempic, liposuction, lap band surgery, or at least told people he was doing these things. He got in trouble, obviously, sort of famously for using campaign funds for what he marked down as Botox, So he clearly wants to look different. And I think that is true of his background as well, right? He grew up in poverty, there's this great scene in the book where he's living in this basement apartment and there are, rats in the basement,
Mm.
right? So it's like not a nice place, in his recollection and that of others. And
And
so he
we do
wants something
actually know
different.
that from multiple sources and not just him, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
That seems to be real,
Mm.
And this, of course, is the challenge of the George Santos
Right.
experience, is separating fact from fiction. But, he wanted this better life. And so when he couldn't get it, he sort of just built it for himself. He like
Yeah.
constructed it out of thin air.
It really seems to pose an interesting challenge to a journalist. I mean, it seems like you have to do a lot of extra work because you can't just take something that he says on the face of it and you have to like track down like almost everything that he says and really do your work, like get multiple sources. And is that actually true? And
Totally.
What was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, so I talked to over 100 people who knew him for this book, listens to hours and hours of podcasts and recordings of him. I even read, I think, 3 or 4 books by the one author that he's ever cited.
Mm-hmm.
He really likes this author, Chris Ann Hall, and I read a bunch of her books, again, to try to get in his head. But like, to give you an example of the experience of separating the fact from the fiction, there's this one claim that he's made that is not very well known. He claims that he was born at 24 weeks gestation. So if do the math in your head, that's very, very early, very, very early if it's true. And so I asked some people about it and tried to get people who were there when he was young and tried to get a sense of like, could that have been true? And I couldn't really get a direct answer. Family members didn't remember one way or the other exactly. So what I did, the only thing I could do, because you can't get the medical records, the only thing you could do is look at the number of people born in New York City and in the United States in that week, at that number of weeks gestation. And it's very, very few, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of go into this in the book of the way you have to like drill down into every claim and at least give a sense of most likely not true, 100% not true. You almost want like percentages on all these claims.
What do we know really about the shape of how he grew up? Like, what were the real conditions as far as you can tell from all the research that you've done about how he grew into the person that we see before us today?
Well, he grew up in this kind of amazing place, which is Jackson Heights, Queens. Queens itself is one of the most diverse places in the world. I mean, there's just every single culture collides in this little part of the world. And so it's kind of amazing. And, you can walk down the street and be in a cafe from every single ethnicity in the universe, and it's really nice. So, and that's where he lived in this kind of Brazilian immigrant enclave. And both of his parents were working pretty hard. They had a little kind of family network there, supporting him. He was very spoiled. I was told that he was kind of, like the only son for a little while. And so, spoiled by his Aunt Alma, who, by the way, he later goes on to steal from, which I found very sad.
Wow.
And again, he always wants more. I talked to a middle school teacher of his who remembers him coming up to the teacher after class, and saying, oh, what can I do to get ahead, And so I think that he wanted a different form of life and started kind of spinning to get it.
Hmm. What do we know about the process that led him to become a realistic, viable candidate for Congress?
Yeah, so this is this amazing story that it's one of those things where everything had to go right for him. If any one minor thing had changed, we don't know the name George Santos. Santos is like a low-level schemer who just continues living his life. But, and we kind of see it in 2020, which was his first campaign, which he lost easily. That's the way it kind of should have been, right? He was a kind of nobody that, got kicked out, of the race. Then what happens in 2022 is that it's the perfect meeting of his lies, his abilities, his, chameleon-like behavior, and this strange political moment. So on Long Island and in parts of New York City, there was a real kind of red wave. People were sick of the COVID stuff. There was a reaction against some criminal justice reforms that Democrats had done. Kind of in a strange way, too, the abortion question, which was a big deal, after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, in other states, right, where you had a Republican governor, this Roe was a huge deal. In New York, less so, right, because Roe was protected in other ways. So that kind of didn't have a big impact on the district. So you have this huge red wave that sweeps Santos in, and he's really eager to kind of ride that wave. So you find him, I read about this in the book. There's a scene where he's like knee deep in snow, like doing a protest about, unmask our kids. So some Republicans would flirt with that stuff, kind of nod at it a little bit, but Santos was all in, jumped in, and he could do it. He was convincing.
In other words, as an inveterate liar, he was very media savvy.
Super media savvy and super just good in a room. He was good at kind of spinning things for a crowd.
Interesting. And what do we know about the money that got him over the line, let alone what he did with it? But what do we know about like who funded him, where his money comes from? I know there's been a lot of controversy around that.
Yeah, and we've been kind of learning more and more, and we probably will continue to learn more and more. But the main controversy is about these loans, right? These very large loans. So in the first place, his campaign finance filing said he loaned himself over $700,000, right? And then it turned out that some of those loans were not really made at the time that he said they were made. And then later we learned that with some of those loans, he actually kind of paid himself back. So he kind of, improperly took this money. And then we also learned that he was he was a connector of sorts. He wanted to be sort of a deal maker in the business world. And he would put himself in the middle of these deals and take a cut from them. And he was also kind of getting money from some of these people that he was affiliated with in the deal-making world. So, but yeah, there's more to learn too. And I think that's going to be one of the things that, could come up in the next few months before his trial.
Even before he was sworn into office, it became very public that there were a bunch of false statements that he made. And the more time that went on during his term, the more duplicity we became aware of. And as best as I understand it, for a long time, because the margin for the Republicans in Congress was very, very narrow, he was protected to a degree by Kevin McCarthy, who wanted to preserve that narrow margin. And so twice an attempt was made to expel him, which failed. Is that roughly accurate, that he was kept in as long as he was? Because basically the Republicans needed the votes?
I think that's one reason. It was a really tight majority. In some ways, that seemed to have been a real reason that he was sworn in the first place, right? That the Republicans couldn't really afford to block this guy. He was clearly going to be a very reliable Republican vote, very conservative vote. So that kind of helped protect him for a while. There was even some chatter about whether it was going to prevent him from getting kicked out at all today. The Republican leadership was being very quiet about what they were going to do. They very publicly said, we're not going to kind of whip this vote. And then it turned out that a lot of the high level Republicans voted against expelling him. So clearly there was concern at the top about kicking him out. And they say the precedent that this sets as well.
What was it that finally changed that allowed him to be removed this time around?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that you have to look at. One is that certainly some Republicans, like ones in New York who are in kind of vulnerable seats, were really